House Democrats have formally introduced an article of impeachment against President Trump, and leadership says it will move forward on it this week if the 25th Amendment is not invoked soon. Republicans blocked the Democrats' resolution calling on Mike Pence, the vice president, to invoke the 25th Amendment to remove President Trump from office. This move sets up a full House vote on Tuesday. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says if the vice president doesn't respond in 24 hours, Democrats will move forward with an article of impeachment accusing the president of inciting an insurrection. A House impeachment vote could come as soon as Wednesday, but if passed, the Senate may not begin a trial until after President-elect Joe Biden begins his term.
If we impeach him this week, that it should be immediately transmitted to the Senate.
Outside, and we've been getting briefed.
Let's go.
Ahead of the inauguration, the chief of the National Guard says up to 15,000 troops could be deployed to the nation's capital. At the same time, the FBI is warning of plans for armed protests at all 50 state capitals and in Washington, leading up to President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration. We reached out to the state police, who tell us LSP continually monitors potential security concerns to ensure safety for protesters, Capitol grounds, and the surrounding community. We will not be able to provide specific information regarding security measures.
Well, in the meantime, we reached out to Louisiana's 5 congressmen for comment on the resolution to impeach President Trump for a second time. So far, only one has responded. Clay Higgins, a Republican from the Lafayette area, said, "I am firmly opposed to this Democrat political stunt. I am a no on any impeachment vote and the resolution to invoke 25th Amendment procedures. These unwarranted maneuvers only serve to further divide our country." Tulane political science associate professor Brian Brock says that impeachment is the House Democrats' last tool to hold President Trump accountable for the violence at the Capitol.
I think there's a decent shot that the House of Representatives could go ahead and actually vote on the articles of impeachment. Again, there's no chance the Senate will act on it before January 20th. We'll have to see what the stomach is, particularly among Senate Republicans, for doing this.
Of course, a conviction would take 2/3 or 67 of the 100 votes in the Senate. That would be to convict on impeachment charges. If the president is impeached and convicted, then he could never hold office again.